Okay, well, this is where we're at in the outline for the class. We're going to start with this every week because this is kind of the roadmap for the class and the topics that we're covering. As I thought more about it from last week, I think I'm correct in what I said. Remember, we talked the first week about different approaches to apologetics. There was the classical or traditional approach, the evidentialist approach, and then the presuppositional approach. And the more I've thought about it, I think it is true that one of the things that differentiates the different approaches is what each group finds to be the most compelling aspect of Christianity, or the strongest argument. So even as we've divided the class up into these three sections, God exists, Jesus is God, and the Bible is from God, it does seem to me that classical, traditional apologists like myself tend to find that the arguments for God's existence are the strongest of the three. Now, we obviously believe in the other two, but we find the first set of arguments, the arguments that God exists, to be the strongest, most compelling arguments. And then evidentialists are more into the evidential pieces of evidence for like the New Testament, for Jesus' resurrection, and so they are going to emphasize what they find to be the most compelling arguments. And then at least some presuppositionalists are most confident in the Bible. And so, sometimes you'll talk to a presuppositionalist and they'll say that the reason they believe that God exists and the reason they believe that Jesus is God is because the Bible says it. Because that's where their emphasis or their confidence is the greatest, is in the Bible. The Bible really is from God. And so whatever the Bible says then would be true. And so presuppositionalists will often start with the Bible because that's what they find to be the most convincing, and that's where their strongest confidence is. So it does make a lot of sense to me why then these three camps have kind of differed from each other, because they find different things more compelling than the others. So we're going to zoom in so you can see this a little bit better and see exactly where we're at in the class. We're focusing on the arguments for God's existence, and we'll look at a few objections to that as well. The three main arguments we're looking at for the existence of God are the argument from first cause, which we looked at last time, tonight's argument, the argument from design, and then the moral argument. So there's many more arguments for the existence of God, of course, but these are the big three, and these are the ones we're going to cover in this class. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm using the term God just as a generic term at this point to mean a supreme being. That's how the term has developed in our English language, and that's how I'm using it right now. So I'll interchange the term God with the term supreme being. That's what I'm referring to, that there is a supreme being. So tonight we're looking at the design argument for the existence of God, and there's several versions of this. Sometimes design arguments are called teleological arguments, and we're only going to look at three of them tonight. So we're actually going to look at three design arguments, but you'll see they all pretty much follow the same form. So, for example, the first one we're going to look at starts out with premise 1. Every design has a designer. Premise 2, the universe has design. Therefore, the universe has a designer, the conclusion. The second argument we're going to look at follows the same form, but it's focusing in on the earth itself. So we've got a design argument that there's design in the universe. It seems like the earth itself has been designed. And then the last one is life. So we're zooming in even more, finding design in the greatest aspects of the material universe, and also some of the fine details and specific things within the universe, i.e. life here on earth. So they follow the same pattern. We're going to look at the universe, earth, and then life. As you can see, they all start with the same premise. So that's where we're going to start as well. That every design has a designer. But before we get there, I want to show you that these type of arguments, just like the first cause arguments, can be found throughout history among various different people groups and cultures. These aren't new arguments. They've been around for thousands of years. For example, we'll look at a few here real quick. Socrates argued that the world seemed providentially designed by a vastly knowledgeable and powerful being. And to make his case, he pointed to the purpose he found in simple things of life, sometimes things that we take for granted. For example, I remember reading where Socrates talked about eyelashes and how even our eyelashes seem to have a purpose or a design in that they shield our eyes. So Socrates found design in some of the even simple things that we take for granted and thought that that pointed to a supreme being. Plato, another example, in the Timaeus, Plato suggested a divine craftsman, a demiurge, who used the Platonic forms, what we call them today, but what Plato said used these eternal, transcendent, universal truths to make or craft the physical world. Plato argued for a divine being from the order of the motion of the stars and of all the things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe. Plato also argued that there must be a best soul who is the maker and father of all, the king who ordered the primordial chaos into the rational cosmos that we observe today. So it's the same sort of design arguments that we see many different cultures come to this very conclusion. And it's not just Western cultures. I'll give you an example from an Eastern culture. So in a commentary to Brahma Sutras, I'm probably not going to pronounce this correctly, Adi Sankara argues that the original karmic actions themselves cannot bring about the proper results at some future time. Neither can supersensuous, non-intelligent qualities like artstra by themselves mediate the appropriate, justly deserved pleasure and pain. The fruits, according to him, must be administered through the action of a conscious agent, namely a supreme being, which he called Ishvara. So you see these design arguments, a lot of cultures, a lot of people groups throughout history around the world come to these same conclusions from these type of design arguments. They're nothing new. One of the reasons they've been around so long is that they're very compelling. I find this to be design arguments, probably the strongest arguments for the existence of God. Of course, we're going to look at more recent arguments that have been strengthened by modern science. Again, I'm going to be leaning on this particular scientist. Since I'm not a scientist myself, I lean on professional academic scientists to understand some of these issues. And I'll be leaning primarily on this individual we looked at last week, Stephen Barr, who's a physics professor at the University of Delaware. So very good credentials. I'm not making an argument from authority. However, if somebody's studied this and has such great credentials, I think it gives them a little bit more credibility when they talk about some of these scientific issues. That's why I'm leaning on him and others like him. As I mentioned, all of these arguments start with the same premise, and that is every design has a designer. Of course, what I mean by designer here is an intelligent mind. Okay? So you can rephrase the first premise. Every design is the result of an intelligent mind, a designer. Now, this is an inductive premise, like most initial premises are in arguments. This is an inductive premise. In other words, it's based on it's based on observations, empirical observations. The fact is, we've just never seen design come from anything else but an intelligent mind. Is it possible that design could come from another source? Sure, it's possible. We've just never observed it. So this is an empirical premise based on our observations. Every time we see design, it's from an intelligent mind, i.e. a designer. So we're not going to spend much time here on this first premise. We're going to focus more on premise 2. As I mentioned, all of these arguments share a common form, that there is design in the universe, in the earth, and in life. But before we start looking into these 3 areas, we might want to ask ourselves, well, how do we detect design in the first place? How do we know when we've discovered design? Well, we can fairly precisely. Think of, for example, archaeologists. I just watched with my family, the new movie called The Dig. And it's based on a true story. It's based on a 1938 excavation in England. It's the Sutton Hoo excavation, where they discovered a buried ship, which included in the ship a burial chamber there in England. And so it was a really good movie. We really enjoyed it. And it caused us to learn a little bit about the things that they discovered in that buried ship. You can see it here in this picture. And the artifacts they discovered, this discovery has been called the greatest archaeological find ever. Now, that might be a little bit exaggerated, but it was very impressive. From the 6th, possibly 7th century. So Anglo-Saxon discovery. So here's just one example of something that was found at this site, this mask. So beautiful, and you can see the middle of the mask is shaped like a bird. So really cool. But you can ask, how, when these archaeologists were digging in this burial mound, this ship that had been buried in the dirt, how would they know when they had discovered something that was designed by intelligent minds, i.e. humans? How would they know, for example, if they came across something like this as they were digging in the dirt, how would they know if that was just some random piece of nature or if it was actually designed by an intelligent mind? If it was maybe some bowl or a plate or something. Now, sometimes it's hard to tell. Like, for example, this might be just a random piece of nature, or it might have been designed. But sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's just without a doubt. If somebody would find, for example, this is another piece they found at the Sutton Hoo excavation, they just know immediately, without a doubt, that they found something designed. Well, how? How would they know that? What leads them to that conclusion? You may say, well, it's obvious, isn't it? And it is kind of common sense, but we can get more specific. What makes it obvious? An archaeologist, as well as other scientists like forensic scientists, have really made this more objective, so it doesn't just have to rely on intuition or a gut feeling. They've actually objectified and mathematized this process. So the key evidence of design is specified complexity. This is how we can determine if something is designed or not, if it has these 2 attributes, specificity and complexity. Let's talk about complexity first. If something is complex, that basically just means that it has multiple parts. There are many parts to it. It is complex. And specificity means that these parts are arranged in a very specific, non-random arrangement. So specified complexity, when that is seen, they know immediately it was designed. This forms the basics of the famous William Paley example. You might have heard this before, William Paley was a big thinker in the 1700s during the Enlightenment era. And William Paley put this argument together about a watch that somebody would find on the ground. If you were walking through the forest or on a beach and you would come across a watch like this, you would know immediately that it just didn't happen accidentally. You would know that it is designed because it has specified complexity. It has multiple parts, it's complex, and it has a non-random arrangement of those parts. Therefore, you would conclude that it was designed, as everybody would. In fact, you'd have a very hard time trying to convince somebody that it wasn't designed by an intelligent mind. I don't think anybody would believe you if you tried to make that argument. Now, atheists admit this. Atheists understand this. This is nothing unique to this argument. This is nothing unique to theists or theism or Christianity or anything. This is just well-known facts within science. And I'll give you an example. Somebody from the opposite team, so to speak, affirming this very thing. You might have seen this movie, Contact, late 90s, great movie, Jodie Foster, Matthew McConaughey, wonderful movie. I really enjoy watching this movie about every 5 or 10 years. It seems like I see it. Now, it's important to note that this movie was based on a novel by Carl Sagan. And you might remember or know who Carl Sagan is. He's one of the most famous atheist agnostics from the late 20th century. Very famous, well-known science professor at both Harvard and Cornell. Now, in this novel that Carl Sagan wrote, and then later in the movie that was made based on the novel, the main character, which is played by Jodie Foster, works for SETI, which is actually a real-life organization that Carl Sagan helped start. SETI just stands for the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's a lot of money and people and technology trying to find intelligence in space. And I don't make fun of that. I think that's a legitimate enterprise. But it is a real thing that exists. SETI is a real thing. You can look it up and read about it in the real world. It's not just in the movie. But they utilized this fictional development in the movie that the main character, Jodie Foster, who works for SETI, becomes convinced that she has discovered intelligence out in space. She's detected design out in space. And when she shares the evidence, nobody questions it. Everybody in the movie, and then the novel written by Carl Sagan, agrees that yes, there must be intelligence out there because of what she found. Well, what is it? What is this evidence that made her think that she had discovered intelligence out in space? Well, she found a radio signal. Within the movie, within the book, she found a radio signal which was repeating all the prime numbers between 0 and 100 in order. So as soon as she discovered this radio signal, she knew immediately she had discovered intelligent life, i.e. design. And why? Well, it's the same thing, specified complexity. What she found was something that was complex, that had multiple parts, all these numbers between 0 and 100, and they were specified in a non-random arrangement, a very specific pattern, the smallest up to the greatest, so all the prime numbers between 0 and 100. Specified complexity. So this isn't something that our side admits to, this is something that the other side, in this case atheists who reject the existence of God, admit to the idea of how to find design, specified complexity. Well, now that we know how to detect design, let's see if there is, in fact, design to be found in the universe at large. So we're going to be looking at the universe itself to see if it gives evidence of design, i.e. specified complexity. Here in Nebraska, where I live, just right outside of Lincoln, it's between Lincoln and Omaha here in Nebraska, is the SAC Museum. and we go to this often. We took our kids to it while they were growing up. It's the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum. And it's a lot of fun. They've got a lot of planes and missiles and stuff. But one of the things they have there that has always fascinated me is they have a Apollo Command Space Module from the 1960s. And I'm always fascinated every time I go. This is one of the most fascinating things for me to look at, because you can see in it and see all of the complex engineering which went into creating these spacecrafts. And the reason why the engineering has to be so precise and so complex and specified is because the engineers had to design an environment for life in space. They had to design everything that was necessary, from temperature to oxygen, etc., so that the astronauts' life could exist in space. And I'm always amazed by the engineering that went into it, going all the way back to the 1960s. These engineers had to set everything just right to create an environment in which life can exist. Similarly, the universe itself, like a spacecraft, seems to have been precisely designed to create an environment in which life can exist. Very specified so that it was possible, just like life existing in space in a spacecraft, the universe seems designed very intricately so that life could exist. Everything set just right. I want to give you a quote from Stephen Barr, the scientist at the University of Delaware that I lean on a lot. He says, what's so coincidental about this is that certain characteristics of the laws of physics, and remember he's a physics professor, seem to coincide exactly with what is required for the universe to be able to produce life, including intelligent beings like ourselves. So we're looking at the laws of physics, basically, the laws of nature, sometimes they're referred to. And these laws seem to have been set just right so that life can exist in the universe. Think of it, if you will, almost like this large control room with all of these dials. All of these dials, they could be set to different degrees, right? And imagine if all of these dials were set or dialed in to the exact right number for that particular dial, and each one has to be set just right, and all of them right at the same time in order for life to exist. That's kind of what we're getting at here. There's more than 100 that we know of so far of these constants, these physical constants, laws of nature, so to speak, that seem to be set just right. Sometimes they're called fine-tuned constants, so that life could exist. If any of them were off just a little bit, any of the dials moved just a tiny hair, tiny fraction, life would not be possible. And so it seems like the universe has been designed. I'm going to give you just two examples. There's over 100 that we know of so far, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is the gravitational constant, the gravitational force that we all deal with, right? Well, if this gravitational force, the gravitational constant, was different by merely this small, tiny percentage, I'm not even going to try to describe it, then the sun would not exist, and the moon would either crash into the earth or shear off into space. So this setting of the universe, so to speak, the gravitational constant, seems to be set just right for life. The other one is something that we looked at last week. You might remember George Smoot. He won the Nobel Prize in 1992 when he discovered the expansion rate of the universe. And remember, he found some slight variations in the background radiation that was discovered. Well, this expansion rate of the universe had to be set just right in order to enable matter to congregate together in galaxies, stars, and planets. Not too great, or the universe would have collapsed back in on itself. But it had to be great enough so that these things, galaxies, planets, and stars, would congregate together and form. This is one of the reasons why Stephen Hawking, one of the world's most famous scientists in the last 50 years, said that Smoot's discovery was probably the greatest discovery of all time. I want to give you a quote here now from Stephen Hawking about this. He said, "Why did the universe start out with so nearly the critical rate of expansion that separates models that recollapse from those that go on expanding forever? That even now, 10,000 million years later, it is still expanding at nearly the critical rate. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have collapsed before it ever reached its present size." So again, this seems to be one of those things that was set just perfectly so that life could exist, so that the universe itself could even exist the way that it does. As I said, there's over 100 of these constants that we know of so far, and because there's so many and because they all seem to be set just right, this has led many scientists and philosophers to conclude that the universe was designed. Here's a quote from Arno Penzias, another astronomer we looked at last week, one of the co-discoverers of the radiation afterglow that won them the Nobel Prize. But look what he wrote. He said, "Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might even say supernatural, plan." As we discussed last week, a supernatural is just something beyond nature. And so it seems like since these things we're talking about are nature itself, then the cause of them or the design of them have to be beyond space, time, and matter, beyond nature, and that's all that supernatural means. One more quote, and then I want to show you guys a video. This is a quote from Stephen Barr. He wrote, "When ancient writers like Minucius Felix praised the providence, order, and law in the heavens and the earth, they spoke about something of which they could have only fragmentary glimpses. If we look at the world around us, we see only hints of order here and there, peeking out from amidst a great deal of apparent irregularity and haphazardness. But science, in particular physics, which is Barr's specialty, science has given us new eyes that allow us to see down to the deepest roots of the world's, universe's structure, and there all we see is order and symmetry of pristine mathematical purity." Design. Well, I want to show you a video from William Lane Craig's ministry, and this is a video that really does a good job summarizing this particular argument, the design argument when it comes to the universe. Sometimes it's called the fine-tuning of the universe argument. So take a look. It's 4 or 5 minutes, and we'll put the link down below so you can watch it better straight on William Lane Craig's YouTube channel.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological laws. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be light primitive. Or another example of function: if the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be light permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a light prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a light permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
Studying some of these things this last week kind of gives me an odd feeling. It's like, I would imagine it's similar to the feeling that astronauts would have when they're in that space shuttle up in space, that any little thing that could go wrong and it'd be instant death. And just studying these things this last week and thinking about how everything has to be so perfect, not only in the universe, but also just in our own solar system for life to exist. And if anything changes, boom, there'd be no more life whatsoever. It's given me that feeling that, wow, we're just balanced delicately like in a spaceship, and if anything went wrong, we'd be instantly gone. So it's pretty crazy to think about sometimes. Well, as I said, this fine-tuning argument of the universe is what most people say, the strongest argument for the existence of God. And not only theists say that, a lot of atheists admit this is the best argument. Even though they don't find it compelling, they agree that this fine-tuning argument is the best one. And I'll give you an example of that. You might know of Christopher Hitchens. He's passed away now, but he was one of the most famous atheists the last 20 or 30 years. He was one of the new atheists. You might remember that phrase being thrown around quite a while ago. But Christopher Hitchens said this, take a look. He said, at some point, certainly we are all asked, which is the best argument you come up against from the other side, in this case from theists. He was an atheist. I think every one of us atheists, picks the fine-tuning as the most intriguing. That 1 degree, just 1 hair different, and then nothing. We wouldn't be here. You have to spend time thinking about it, working on it. It's not a trivial argument, and we all say that. So they admit that this is probably the strongest argument for God, the fine-tuning of the universe. Well, let's move on now to the second design argument we're going to look at, and that is that there is design here even just on Earth or within our own solar system. Now, there's several facets we could look at, but again, for the sake of time, we're just going to look at 3. So, for example, take a look. The distance we are, that is, the planet Earth from the sun, seems to be set just right. This is from Stephen Barr again. He wrote that Earth is not so close to the sun that we burn up, but not so far away that we freeze solid. Earth is large enough to have sufficient gravity to retain an atmosphere, but not so large that it retains hydrogen gas, which would be the wrong kind of atmosphere, at least for us. Give you another example. This has to do with our air quality, if you will, oxygen, CO2 in the air. If the CO2 level was just slightly higher, a runaway greenhouse effect would develop and burn us all up. This is one of the reasons that people get so worked up and are worried about, this issue. If the level was slightly lower, plants wouldn't be able to maintain efficient photosynthesis and we'd all suffocate. So it seems like here on Earth, the air, oxygen level, CO2 level has been set just right. Another one you might not have thought about before is the rotation of the Earth. I've been reading about this for another project lately, and I was amazed to find out that this 24-hour rotation period of the Earth is exactly what it has to be for life to exist. If it was slightly different, life wouldn't be possible. Take a look. If the rotation of the Earth was much longer than 24 hours, temperature differences would be too great between night and day, and we wouldn't be able to survive. If the rotation period were a bit shorter, atmospheric wind velocities would be too great, over like 200 miles per hour. So it seems like this 24-hour period is the exact right one, such that we can experience this sort of stability that we experience in temperature and wind velocity for life to not only exist, but thrive. As I said, there's many more. You can think of them, the size and placement of Jupiter, more about our atmosphere, the thickness of the Earth's crust, so on and so forth, all these things that seem to make Earth perfectly designed for life. It's fairly amazing when it comes to the moon and the gravitational balance between us and the moon, and how that, if it was slightly different, it would throw things off and there could not be any life here on Earth. All these things in our solar system seem to be set just right for life. So that's the second argument. We went through that quickly. So let's get to the third one, and that is the design that we see in life. Now, as you can imagine, this third version of the design argument isn't as popular today as it used to be, mostly because of the theory of evolution. So, we're going to talk about evolution next week. The entire lecture will walk through that issue. But for now, let me just say that even in spite of the theory of evolution, some people still find this design argument very compelling. For example, this part of the design argument was a large reason, one of the large reasons why Antony Flew, another famous atheist from the 20th century, actually moved away from atheism because of what, as he saw, design in life itself. It was a very famous conclusion when he changed his mind and wrote a book about it and came to the conclusion that there is a supreme being. And part of why he changed his mind was because of what this argument we're going to look at now, that there is design in life. So let's start out with just the simplest form of life that we're aware of, a single-celled organism, right? Very simple life. And not too long ago, maybe a little over 100 years ago, most scientists thought that the cell, so a single-celled organism, thought that the cell was just a blob of protoplasm. They didn't think there was much to it, and so it was very easy for them to speculate and consider how maybe some chemicals came together accidentally in some primordial soup and formed the first cell, or reproducing cell, the first single-celled organism that could reproduce itself, and then evolution would go on from there, according to the theory of evolution. So they thought of the cell as a very simple thing, just kind of a blob of protoplasm. But while over the last 100 years, telescopes have allowed us to zoom in and understand our universe and space more accurately, the development of microscopes have allowed us to zoom in and understand life in much more intricate detail than we ever have before. And what we've discovered is that even the single-celled organism is anything but simple. In fact, what we've discovered is that what's going on here literally is a factory that's producing other factories. It's not simple at all. One thing I want to focus on is the discovery of DNA. Now, in the 1950s, it was confirmed that DNA contained genetic information. And this is huge. Information is right there within every single cell. This DNA includes encoded instructions for how to build all living things. DNA is an entire language built on a 4-letter alphabet. Now, you might think that that's not very impressive, a 4-letter alphabet. I mean, our English alphabet has 26 letters in it, right? But consider that everything a computer does, everything that goes on digitally in our world is done with a 2-letter alphabet, 0 and 1. So DNA is a 4-letter alphabet, and it can write, communicate, record, encapsulate an incredible amount of information. In fact, Bill Gates, who knows a lot about computers and software, Bill Gates said DNA is the most efficient language and storage device in the known universe. It's very remarkable. So how much information is written in the DNA of just the simplest life, right? Let's go back to that single-celled organism. How much is written in the DNA of a single-celled organism? We're going to go back to Stephen Barr here, take a look at a quote from him. He wrote that even a bacterium, single-celled organism, the simplest kind of living thing, has, according to some molecular biologists, an enormously complicated structure. By some reckonings, it would take as great a quantity of information as there is in the Encyclopedia Britannica to describe all the parts of a bacterium and how they are put together. And that's just a single-celled organism, the simplest form of life that we know of. Nothing to say about a cat or a dog or a human being. It's incredible how much information is packed into DNA. As I said earlier when we were talking about archaeologists, language or information is one of the clearest examples of design, because think about it, a language, information, has complexity, has multiple parts, letters that develop into words, sentences, paragraphs, etc., etc., multiple parts, and it has specificity. A language is arranged in a specific order, non-random arrangement. This is why some people have argued that DNA is the strongest evidence of design. One of the ones who makes this argument very powerfully is Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer got his PhD from Cambridge University, and this book is very well known of his. He makes this argument based on DNA signature in the cell. DNA and the evidence for intelligent design. Here's a quote from his book. He said, "Our uniform experience affirms that specified information, whether inscribed hieroglyphics, written in a book, encoded in a radio signal, or produced in a simulation experiment, always arises from an intelligent source, from a mind, and not a strictly material process." Again, this is just an inductive, empirical observation. We've never seen design, much less information and language, come from any other source than an intelligent mind. So the conclusion to all of these arguments, of course, is that therefore there must be a designer. Whether it's the universe or earth or life, all of these things, since they have evidence of being designed, point to, therefore, then, a designer. Now, you probably noticed that this argument doesn't end with God, just like the previous one. The first cause argument ended with cause, there must be a cause of the universe. This one ends with a designer. So you might say, well, how do we get then from a designer to a God or a supreme being? Well, we use abductive reasoning, just like we discussed last week. Abductive reasoning is when we think, okay, there's an infinite amount of possible explanations, but what's the best one? What's the inference to the best explanation based on reasonableness, plausibility, scope, etc., etc.? So we can narrow down, just like if we heard a knock at the door, there's an infinite amount of possibilities. It could be Pharaoh who rose from the dead. It could be a giraffe knocking at my door. Could be aliens from Mars. I mean, the possibilities are endless. But the most likely scenario is that it's Mike, because I see his car out the window. He said he was going to be here at this time, and he just sent me a text on my phone that says he's here. So that's the best explanation. Similarly, we can get to a supreme being or God using this process of abductive reasoning. Now, I just wrote a paper about this, advocating for this abductive version of the design argument. The paper is called A Cabin in the Woods. It's going to be published soon in Liberty University's academic journal, but you can find it right now on my website, convincingproof.org. So take a look. You can read about it. It's called A Cabin in the Woods. When we find design, just like when we find a cabin in the woods, we infer that it was built by an intelligent mind. And it's the same thing when we find design in the universe, earth, or life. It seems very reasonable to infer that it was built by some sort of an intelligent mind. Because, again, I'm going to beat this like a dead horse, we've only ever observed design coming from an intelligent mind. We've just never seen it come from any other source. So it seems very reasonable to infer that when we found design, specified complexity, that we would infer that it comes from some sort of an intelligent mind, because we've just never seen design come from any other source. This is why so many have concluded the best explanation here is that the universe, earth, and life was designed by an intelligent mind. And it has to be a mind outside the universe, because it's the universe, one of the things that is itself designed. So if there is design in the universe, that's why one of the Nobel-winning scientists said it must be a supernatural source beyond nature, because nature, i.e. the universe itself, is what we're talking about that is designed. A few more quotes by some other folks who have come to this conclusion. Here's one from Stephen Barr again, making the same sort of inference. He says, if symmetry is found in works of art of every sort and is an important element in what is to be beautiful, and if as well the laws of nature are based on symmetries that are so sophisticated and so deep that while we may study them with the tools of modern mathematics, they lie far above our mental powers to appreciate on an intuitive level. Does that not then suggest the mind of an artist at work that is far above the level of our own minds? A quote here from Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle is a professor of astronomy at Cambridge University. He wrote that a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as, like we saw in life, chemistry and biology. There are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The number one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. So if we want to take some of these inferences from this argument, the design argument, and the first cause argument from last week, we can come to some of these conclusions that this first cause or designer must be incredibly powerful, right? To create the universe out of nothing. No space, no time, no matter, completely out of nothing. Must be supernatural, we've talked about that, beyond nature, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, because all of those things began when the universe began. So it has to be beyond space, time, and matter. And extremely intelligent, to be able to design not only the mathematics of the universe, but then also down to our solar system and then life, the DNA. The information that's written in DNA is just, to me, overwhelming evidence of design and intelligence. Now, it's no coincidence that this is how most theists throughout history in different cultures who came to the conclusion there must be a supreme being understand God. It's not a coincidence that this is how most theists understand God, because most theists throughout history have come to their conclusion that there is a God through these arguments. So it's not like we're taking two things and being surprised that they're the same, that there's a coincidence. No, most theists have come to the conclusion that there is a God because of these arguments, and that's why they think of God in this way. That's why they've concluded that there must be a supreme being who is like this in all these different cultures around the world throughout history. It's not a coincidence. So the last thing I want to do tonight is look at the main objection. As you can imagine, atheists do have ways that they push back against this argument, right? Most of them agree that the fine-tuning of the universe in particular is the best argument for God, but they haven't been convinced by it, and here's one of the pushbacks that they offer. So I want to tackle that tonight, and that'll be the last thing that we do. So the main objection that people have to these sort of design arguments is basically what they do is they provide an alternate explanation for how this could be. How could it be that the universe is so set just right for life? Earth is set just right for life. How could this be? And the alternate explanation that they come up with, and I watched several videos this week of atheist philosophers and scientists putting forth this alternate explanation, but what they put forth is this: chance. And this is how they word it. Take a look at this. It always goes something like this. If there was an infinite amount of time, then certainly every possible event would ultimately happen, including the emergence of life. Or they might say it like this. I read and watched some other ones say it this way. They say, look, if there were an infinite amount of planets in our universe, then certainly at least one of them would be balanced just right for life. Or some of them say it like this: if there was a multiverse, in other words, an infinite amount of different universes, then certainly at least one of them would have all the dials set just right so that life could exist. So this is the main objection that's given forth for, in particular, the fine-tuning argument, but really the argument for design. So how would we respond to this objection? Well, there are several responses. One of them we've already seen from last week is that there's just not good evidence that time has existed from infinitely a past existence of time. Time doesn't seem to be infinite. Time seems to have had a beginning. So we can cross off that one right from the beginning, right? Time does not seem to be infinite. We have good evidence that time is finite. There's not an infinite past. As was mentioned in the video, the next response that we can give is that it's impossible to verify any of these theories empirically, right? This is one of those situations where, yeah, you can come up with all sorts of possibilities, but there'd be no way to empirically prove them. It's not that we haven't yet, it's that we can't. We never could observe these things. We could never verify empirically through observation if there were an infinite amount of planets or universes, because by definition they would be unobservable. So bottom line, this is pure speculation. The third response is that it's really, this alternate explanation is what's called a deus ex machina, a god out of the machine, which is often used as a plot device, right, and criticized for basically too good of an explanation. It explains too much. This alternate explanation could be used to explain anything. For example, somebody might come along, visit America, and see Mount Rushmore. And not knowing the history, they could say, wow, how did this come about? How could this be? These faces on the mountain like this. Well, if somebody wants to use this alternate explanation, they could explain anything with it. They could say, well, just think, if there were an infinite amount of universes, then certainly at least one of them would have a mountain that just happened to look like that. And we just happen to live in that particular universe. And so it can just explain too much. The fourth response we can give is that it seems to result in absurdities that no scientist would affirm. All right, this alternate explanation leads to crazy absurdities. This is a quote from Stephen Barr again, scientist at the University of Delaware. He said, look, if all possible universes exist, then there's a universe where The Wizard of Oz is a true story and another universe where Kermit the Frog is a real person. Now, no scientist would affirm that. No scientist would believe that these things could be true. However, this alternative explanation would affirm if there is an infinite amount of universes, then any absurdity you could think of would be true. Lastly, it's interesting, if you think about this, why are these folks who put forth this alternate explanation, why are they comfortable with the idea of infinite planets or an infinite amount of universes, but they're not willing to accept the idea of an infinite being? In other words, to avoid an infinite being, to avoid the idea of the existence of God, they've proposed instead infinite time, infinite planets, or infinite universes. We'll close here with a quote from Stephen Barr once again. I think this is very wise what he said here. In order to explain the origin of life from inanimate matter in a way that doesn't invoke divine intervention, it may be necessary to postulate an unobservable infinity of planets. How ironic that, having renounced belief in God because God is not material or observable by sense or instrument, the atheist may be driven to postulate not one, but an infinitude of unobservables in the material world itself. It seems that to abolish one unobservable God, it takes an infinite number of unobservable substitutes. I think this is really powerful. The other thing we could do is we could go through some philosophical arguments against the possibility of actual infinites. We're not going to do that tonight, but you can look it up online. There's a lot of good philosophical arguments that it's just impossible for there to be an actual amount of infinite things that actually exist. So you can look up like the infinite rooms in the infinite hotel rooms scenario and different things that philosophers have put together to argue against actual infinites, which would apply against an infinite amount of planets or an infinite amount of universes even. So good philosophical reasons to reject both those ideas. So that's the design argument. We'll take a look real quick. Those of you who are taking the class here in Nebraska through Midwestern, we're going to take a look at the syllabus and the class schedule. Those that are just watching the lecture online, or maybe those taking it in Germany, none of this will apply to you. So where are we at in the class schedule? Tonight is February 11th. We talked about the design argument. You had, 5 chapters to read tonight. Chapter 3, in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Chapter 7, 8, and 9 in Thinking About God. And then Chapter 7 in Love Your God with All Your Mind. So all those reading summaries are due tonight. Make sure you email those to me using the email instructions and the class schedule by tonight at midnight, February 11th. I gave a lecture, of course, on the design argument. Now, looking forward to next week, you've got, again, 5 chapters to read. Chapters 4 and 5 in Frank Turek's book, chapters 10, 12, and 13 in Thinking About God, and then chapter 8 in Love Your God with All Your Mind, I think by J.P. Moreland. So those reading summaries will be due next week on February 18th, and then I will give a lecture on evolution. So you can look forward in the class schedule to see more about when papers are due, when we're going to have exams, and just keep yourself on schedule. If you have any questions about the class logistics, let me know. And the class material. If there's things that I've said that are confusing or you want more information, email me, check out my website, Convincing Proof, and I hope I can be of service.